Hi, everybody. I think we could get started. So anyway, good afternoon. I think you all may know I'm the Acting Dean Robert Levitt, and welcome to the inaugural lecture of filmmaker in residence Isabel Okoro. And just before we get started, I'd like to do the land acknowledgement. The University of Toronto operates for thousands of years, and it has been on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and honor these. Also the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe and means a place on a hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history with gratitude, and we honor these connections as we move forward together. So, Isabel Okoro, who will be delivering today's lecture, is the Daniels faculty first ever filmmaker in residence, a role she assumed in October this year. The residency was established earlier this year as part of the faculty's ongoing commitment to principles of equity and inclusion in the disciplines we teach and practice, providing a platform to emerging and mid-career filmmakers whose art reflects and represents historically underrepresented communities in these disciplines. The residency seeks to understand and to promote how cultural representations created in film and video can help build community across the faculty. As we know, the moving image is a powerful medium and tool with the ability to unite, educate, and activate audiences. This residency invites filmmakers and artists such as Isabel to strategically engage their skills and talents with the potentials and responsibilities of representation in the various forms. In this afternoon's, I'm used to it, it's always at night, but today in the afternoon. In this afternoon's talk, Isabel is going to explore world building as a conceptual and architectural process, exploring how storytelling and visual creation can construct new frameworks of reality. Born and raised in Lagos, Nigeria, Isabel is now based in Toronto, where she produces multidisciplinary art inspired by her identity and by the diverse community of creators from the diaspora of which she's a part. Isabel's work sits comfortably on the boundary between imagination and reality, and world building is her preferred method of storytelling. Over the past 3 years, she has developed a visual universe called Eternity, which she describes as a normatopia, a term of her own creation. Last year, Isabel's solo exhibition, Constructing Eternity, was staged in Mexico City. Other recent projects include the video installation, It's Real, I Watched It Happen, exhibited during Nuit Blanche, Toronto. During Isabel's residency, she has met with and will continue to engage a wide array of our community members through lectures, workshops, and classroom interactions, and she maintains office hours in the South Borden building until the end of this month. Anyone who wishes to meet with her can do so by visiting her there, or by emailing filmmaker@daniels.utoronto.ca. Following Isabel's presentation, Abisola Oni, a second-year MVS student, will conduct a Q&A on stage. So, without further ado, please help me in welcoming Isabel Okoro to the podium. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out today at this time to listen to me talk for a little while. The plan for today is for me to walk everyone through sort of like my process and the way, or rather how I landed on world building as the practice, as like the focus of my practice. And then also later on, we'll be screening some of my films, and I'll be talking a little bit about these films and the process of creating them within my world and within my context. So I would like to start off with this image that I made in 2020, I believe. It's an image of my mother and myself at the bottom, and in the middle of this image are documentations of her place of origin in eastern Nigeria, as well as a photo from my great-grandmother's house. I start off with this image because I think every artist, the starting point for every artist's journey is the moment they were born and the context by which they grew up in, and just the ways that they were taught to navigate the world, and then how they handled those things. And so starting off with a little autobiographical history, I was born and raised in Lagos, Nigeria. I moved to Toronto when I was 15, and I went to boarding school my entire formative years. Thinking about my generation, where a lot of us back home in Nigeria were encouraged after secondary school to move abroad for further education, similar to that sort of pattern that we saw in our parents' generation, where like globalization was at the forefront of everything, and you grow up with people, and then all of a sudden you guys are all spread out across the world, all looking for better opportunities, all hoping for something more progressive than what Nigeria was offering at that time. And so in such a situation, we moving from home out into the diaspora, to the Western world, we then have multiple places that we call home, and we're not restricted to a single geography. So I started to think a lot about what this meant and the multiple spaces that I occupy as an immigrant myself, coming from Nigeria, moving to Canada, being a Black person, being a Black woman, being a Black queer woman, and all these different layers, and how that influences the way that I navigate this world. And at some point, I can't remember exactly when, I was introduced to the work of Homi Bhabha, who had this concept of the third space as sort of a meeting point for different cultures, where they would then meet, interact, and give rise to something new. So we were forming hybrid identities with new meanings. And Homi Bhabha also believed that hybridity was born out of mimicry, and that you would have to basically fake it until you made it. And I saw this a lot in my early years, like here in Canada, whether it's from the accents that we would speak with or the things we would pick up on, basically just trying to fit in. And this concept of identity then becomes like a process of like a constant negotiation and transformation that we can assess through our adaptation to different forms of space. And so next, I wanted to touch on this because I think it's very important to highlight that world building is something that we're exposed to as early on as like maybe 5 or 6. If you had access to playing video games, if you had access to watching movies, there were things that I grew up with that encouraged me to test my creativity and to basically not feel bad about creating something the way I wanted to see it. And so there were a couple games I played growing up that I remember now and I look back on. These games kind of gave me the ability to take control and really position what it was I felt was important and then continue to develop on that and build on that. So anyone who's played video games can probably relate to doing a little bit of world building. So starting the way this lecture will go, I would like to see it as a process presentation, walking you through, again, why I've sort of landed on world building as my main output. I feel it's important to go back in time a little bit and look at the stages over the years and kind of zoom out a bit to see how the bigger picture started to come together or when it started to come together. In January 2019, I made the image on the right. It was from a series I called Love Will Tear Us Apart. All the clothing in that image is from a Toronto-based designer, Spencer Badu, who was one of the first people to give me a chance and really just believe in the stories I was trying to tell. And so Spencer gave me a suitcase full of clothes and I went back to Nigeria for the holidays. At that time, this was like my first year in university. And I created this series of images based on a story of a young couple who was on a search for something more. And what I was trying to do with my work at that time was frame fashion images in a more surreal storytelling format. I was trying to challenge the notion or the idea of what a fashion image was and instead affix it within my world building practice and then add a different dimension, a different layer of meaning to it all. And so in this story, I was thinking about like Lagos as a city. It's very chaotic, very noisy. And then I was thinking of a peaceful, a more calm, like second option. And so when framing the story, I remember I basically said something like, the couple goes from under the warm glow of the sun and they're transported to a backdrop of modern-day Lagos. Then I described this feeling as a search for eternity that was trumped with their ever-present reality. So in this situation, I was sort of working backwards, going from this idea of a more peaceful world to our current realities. And so at the time I created these photos and made this statement, I wasn't thinking about eternity as anything other than a word that could describe this thing that I was interested in. I wasn't thinking about it as a conceptual framework. I wasn't thinking about it as its own space. But slowly, I think eternity started to reveal itself to me. There was a lot of subconscious dialogue I was having with myself that I didn't really realize until the pandemic in 2020. So moving on to 2020, the pandemic was an extremely pivotal point in my practice. This was a time where I went from being so busy with school to having like my finals canceled, and like I remember we had like the longest summer ever. And I was spending a lot of time at home, bored, and not really knowing like what to do, what to spend my time with. And so I would watch interviews, I would listen to podcasts, I would read articles based on the works of artists that I admire, based on the works of contemporary change makers at that time. Solange had released her album When I Get Home the year before, and I remember watching an interview she did with Trevor Noah where she described the album film, as a world that she'd built. I think that interview was the first time in my life that I'd heard that word world building be used in the context of an individual creating something, imposing an idea, and then solidifying it with the visuals. I also got introduced to the work of Wong Kar-wai and his trilogy of films, Days of Being Wild, In the Mood for Love, and 2046. In both of these works, we're basically dealing with representations of culture and memory and the ways that they fragment through time. I think that something that stood out to me was the similarity of this approach to that of thinkers like Toni Morrison, who emphasized that reclaiming cultural memory and establishing a narrative home for Black experiences was crucial towards our progress as a people. I was inspired to think about the ways that our personal and shared narratives work hand in hand to develop and maintain global memory, and therefore I was able to position eternity as an alternate plane of existence that references aspects of the present but's always looking forward. So now getting halfway through 2020, I'd spent a lot of time at this point already looking through my archives. I noticed a lot of imagery that was similar. There was a lot of things that just stood out to me as like me talking to me on a subconscious level. For example, one of them was a lot of the images I was making had this like very warm, intense sun in the background fixed against like a pastel colored sky. It was very prominent, and it was something that I knew I was drawn to aesthetically, but I couldn't really place my finger on what the meaning was or why exactly I was so drawn to this sun. I also noticed that I was now making a lot of images of my friends, so like other young Black people enjoying natural space and the lushness of life. And as this was happening, I met Liz Ikiriko, who's a Toronto-based artist and curator, and Liz invited me to join a duo exhibition called Is Love a Synonym for Abolition? This exhibition was alongside Timothy Yannick Hunter, who's a Canadian artist, and the curatorial basis of the show asked a very simple but loaded question. We were interested in finding out, or at least assessing, whether dreams can exist in the temporal space of Black life and be devoid of subjection. In this process, we were privileged enough to work alongside Catherine McKittrick, who's a great scholar and geographer. And in putting this exhibition together, we had numerous conversations that inspired me to reflect on the journeys of my ancestors through time, as sort of a prequel to this future suggestion that I knew I was about to start making. During one of our conversations, Catherine said something once that stuck with me. She said, "Black people refuse linear temporality." In this triptych, which is called If You Knew How We Got Here, I was basically interested in acknowledging the past, confronting the present, and then putting forward an imaginative representation of the future. In the work, there was a semi-linear progression of time that was sort of consolidated by these related clusters of events. So it's not necessarily linear in the sense that from left to right, we're actually following a straight timeline. But what I did was I grouped historical clusters together per image and then broke it down in the timeline of past, present, and future. So narratively, this image begins with a recollection of enslavement and colonialism. These are subjections that we've been forced to face as Black people historically. As time progresses, we arrived at a supposed freedom state, which is what I would say is where we are right now. In this freedom state, there is a communal realization that it's necessary to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And we're forming bonds that are very important, but at the same time, there's also a little reluctance towards being completely vulnerable, given the historical facts. And in this present, our status of being a target remains, and this is then coupled with what I consider unproductive, sometimes intracommunal discourse, worrying about the wrong things, basically. So there's still some sentiment from the past, definitely, that follows into this present and morphs it into something different, but a little bit too familiar. In this triptych, there's also a recurring presence of a figure in white that I use to represent the transcension of thought through time. In the final image of the triptych, there is a shift from individuality to something more communal. Everyone comes together, and the entire group, dressed in white, signifies that everyone is carrying this new instance of thought, and the burden is no longer on a singular person to do so. And so for me, this triptych was really important to create at that time, because in the years following that, I'm expanding on this third image and this final phase of the triptych and suggesting what it could look like in a more in-depth way. So, Ruth Gilmore defines abolition as a presence. She defines it as one that is always working with past liberation projects. So with this work, I was really trying to ask that the audience be patient with the ideas and really spend time with every image, taking it in. As Catherine mentioned once during our discussion sessions, liberation is also being patient with ideas and representations of Black people. You cannot rush the process. So at this point, I'm sure we can understand how inspired and formative of an introduction to the art world that this was for me. This was my first ever gallery show. And so to be working alongside people like Liz, Timothy, and Catherine McKittrick was a privilege that I do not take for granted. I think at the time I was 19, and there are still ideas from those conversations that I carry with me in my work that I'm trying to make now. So during these conversations for the exhibition, I was introduced to the idea of diaspora literacy for the first time, and I later found the works and the writings of V.V. Clark and Tony Presley Sanon, which gave me further insight into this idea of diaspora literacy and Marasa consciousness. So, for definition, diaspora literacy is a way of understanding the unique, specific experiences and perspectives of people across the African diaspora, acknowledging our shared cultural roots and the layers and stories that shape us. The theory focuses on reading the symbols, languages, and histories that link us, even when they might seem hidden or fragmented. Marasa consciousness is about seeing beyond strict dualities. It's the idea that through combining different African traditions in new spaces, we create something that goes beyond old boundaries, a third thing that is more complex, richer, and inclusive of our multiple identities. So this also brings us back to Homi Bhabha's idea of the third space, and that the ways that tension from opposite sides can create something new and worthwhile. So after the exhibition in 2021, I began asking myself questions on how it was that I could make an image. How can I make an image that truly, patiently, and empathetically reflects the essence of something, whether it's a space, a feeling, an idea, or a moment in time? I was asking myself what sort of images I could make that would highlight the ways we contain multitudes, images that were open to exploring the different but familiar. So this idea of diaspora literacy encapsulates Pan-African, esoteric Pan-African thought that I think goes beyond just writing and seeps into the realm of visual art. So Tony Presley Sanon's concept of Marasa consciousness focused on thinking beyond binaries and how that could create space for new realities. In my series, Surrender to the Flow and Speaking in the Space Around Words, I became re-fascinated by twins as a significant spiritual concept, aligning closely with the large mystification of twins in Nigeria. Nigeria is known as the twins capital of the world, but there's also a very complicated history, starting from the days of infanticide during the missionary days to contemporary, through now, where we then see twins as like a sort of spiritual blessing. So in both of these series, so this one and this, I focused on twins as a visual representation of Marasa consciousness, depicting a third thing, a person, a feeling, or a space that emerged as a result of their evolution. So following these anchoring projects and research that I think honestly shaped the train of thought that has guided my practice till this day, I started to think about my images as a conversation between physical and conceptual space, where one isn't necessarily a function of the other, but these two things converge and diverge to influence human feeling and emotions. Early in my world-building practice, I was attracted to possible ideas of a utopia, which means something that's perfect and usually unachievable. However, during 2020, in a period that I consider, I call it the global Black exhaustion, there was a lot of things happening in the Western world and also back home on the continent that just meant, as a community, as a group of people, we were tired. We were tired of a lot of things and really started to scream about these things that we were tired of. So during this period, I sort of started to feel this disconnect between my reality and the way that I was positioning my train of thought and the way that I was positioning eternity as a utopian space. I don't personally think there's anything wrong with representations of a utopia, but personally, at that time, for me, it just didn't feel aligned to what I was trying to do. I challenged myself, though, to not give into the system, to keep dreaming, keep thinking, keep suggesting. This desire to sustain Black imaginative practices led me to coin the term normatopia to describe visions of this world that I was dreaming of. A normatopia is normal, not perfect. And so the question becomes, what is normal to me? What is normal to you? What is normal to us all in this world? And not thinking about normal as being validated by something that happens frequently, but rather normal as the right to be, normal as the right to be yourself, exist, and see yourself existing with no pressure to conform or act a certain way. I believe that a normatopia is where we land when we think beyond the binaries of a harsh reality and a perfect utopia. Ideas of a normatopia and the early stages of eternity led me to put together my first monograph, Friends in Eternity, to serve as a thesis statement that provided initial visual context to support my ideas. The book included a foreword by Chukwudubem Ukaigwe, who's in the crowd today, and a conversation with a friend of mine, Bumi Augusto, who's also another world builder from Nigeria. This book, Friends in Eternity, was the training ground for a lot of my ideas surrounding representation, space, and communal landscapes, as well as the roles that they would play within eternity. So as I became further interested in exploring my ideas of normatopia and the ways I could relate this back to eternity, I held an exhibition called Magic Dreams as the culmination of a design residency I did with Design TO. With Magic Dreams, I developed these three structures that I call portals, and I was asking myself and my audience three questions, each question in its own portal. The questions I was asking are as follows. Who stays when the fear hugs you? Who said that all that is what is true? What do you dream that is true to you? So these questions sort of serve as an invitation to join me in thinking about what is normal to you, and then dreaming within and beyond that normalness. I was interested in using this installation as a space where our individual and mental energies could come together and be stimulated to think within a proposed futuristic context, where there was space to put forward personal ideas of a dream world that acknowledges our realities but encourages utopic modification along the way. Okay. So now with all that groundwork laid, we finally get to some films. I'd made one or two films before 2020, before 2022, but I'll leave those out of this presentation for the sake of propelling the conversation forward. I'll be screening 4 films right now, starting with a film called The Other Side of Dreaming, then one called Everything is Possible Under the Wonderful Moon, another called Come to Me, I'm Already Here, and then lastly, one called It's Real, I Watched It Happen. These films will take roughly 15 minutes to screen, and then I'll be back on the podium to continue discussing.
Water carried the sound of the drums, and sound covered the distance between the old and the new world.
Oh! What do you think's on the other side of dreaming?
I never imagined another side. But then I heard the vibrations that these waves carried with them. And now I can feel the sun calling. What is this?
Maybe it's a call shower. I think there's another world on the other side of dreaming.
Who are you and where have you come from? What do you think of when you hear the word home?
A place of safety and acceptance to come and return to.
What have you done?
Tried. A lot.
Why did you do it?
To be able to offer more because I believe there's the potential there packed in my life.
I did it and will keep on doing it because I can and because I yearn to.
The possibility of the peace we're all promised from the fulfillment of a full life. Love, care, and each of the grand beautiful things that just being alive entitles us to.
Who are your ancestors?
Everyone who came before me. The connections they made of their lives and the fates they pursued. I believe that no matter how shallow or deep it took form in their lives, they thought of me. I communicate with them through the worship of my own life, sometimes verbally, with thanks and prayer, and sometimes just through perseverance and understanding that my life was uniquely predetermined by the flow of theirs.
My ancestors are all the tender and lovely beings who have come before me. I do not communicate with them directly as I do not know their names. I call to them by journaling and referring to them as dear universe. Are your dreams individual or communal?
Communal. Nothing I aspire to or dream about exists without my community. The peace and fulfillment I desire will spoil if it is ever realized without the fullness of my community to carry it with. Individual dreams I harbor exist only to prime me for the grander dreams of my community.
Whether personal or communal, tap into each realm simultaneously and separately or at once.
Through divine guidance and diligence, or fear and ignorance, who I am now presently has followed from where I began in the earliest of my memories. Reading these words reaffirm that I am grateful for the opportunity to be living my life.
What will you reach for when you're finally free?
Thank you guys for sitting through those films. So filmmaking. Filmmaking is something for me that emerged within my practice. I didn't always think that I would be a filmmaker or that I wanted to be one, but in the process of my photography practice and then getting into world building, I was constantly in search of something that felt more complete than the still image. I think photography is the beginning of everything that I do. A lot of my references are usually still images, but at the same time, there was just this other world of possibility that filmmaking opened up for me that I knew if I could tap into, I would be much more successful when trying to convince people of certain ideas. So the first film we saw today was called The Other Side of Dreaming. And this is one of the films that is actually set in eternity. So Dreaming is a small coastal town off the shore. And this short film was basically me kind of playing with that idea of dreaming as a space, but also the mental act of dreaming. And so the title, The Other Side of Dreaming, really comes from my curiosity on what exactly it is that we find on this other side of our dreams. So while this manifests as a physical exploration in eternity, I intentionally define the space to suggest at the same time like a more non-literal thought. So in our own personal context, what do we find when we cross that boundary of dreaming and living? Is it freedom? Is it fear? Perhaps it's a mix of both these things. I think at this point, it's important for me to note that not all my work is based in eternity. Not all the work that I do will be grounded or will be positioned as belonging within this conceptual space. But I think that eternity is sort of this expansion of my concept of normatopia. And so the term normatopia sort of acts as this conceptual bridge that influences a lot of my work, whether or not it is based in eternity. So that constant search for what is normal, but not perfect. In the second film we saw today, it was also based within eternity in a region called Luna Mira, which is the land of the wonderful moon. So Luna Mira, the way I've developed this space is to be known for carrying a spiritual presence where land, light, and water intersect. So with the film, everything is possible under the wonderful moon. It was really for all lovers of love. It was a conversation between sound and space that I think then gave birth to an intense feeling between the two characters. So this secret third thing. With the way the film was presented, to me, it doesn't really matter how they met. All that matters is that they did meet and they had a connection and were exploring that connection. The next film I screened was called Come to Me. The next film I screened was called It's Real, I Watched This Happen. And this film was created as part of an installation I did at Nuit Blanche, Toronto last fall. And with the installation, I actually brought back ideas from Magic Dreams and had the same 3 portals positioned around the screen, asking viewers the same questions, trying to assess our own personal histories and this idea of normal. And finally, I showed a film called Come to Me, I'm Already Here. This was filmed in Osun State in Nigeria, about 4 hours away from Lagos. It was my first time leaving Lagos and going somewhere that wasn't my parents' like village, like where they came from. So I went to somewhere completely different. And I remember I didn't tell my mom that I was going there because she would never let me go. But it was very important for me to go because Adeju Thompson, who's the creative director of Lagos Space Program, the fashion brand, he's been a very close friend and collaborator of mine over the last few years. And he was nominated for a Walmart Prize and really wanted to push the boundaries of what a visual coming from like the motherland could look like and could communicate to people. And so with this film, with Adeju and I both being queer, I was thinking about this idea of queerness allowing everything to be possible, basically, and queerness opening up this door of possibility. But at the same time, also thinking about this idea of constantly returning to yourself, which is a concept that I think is central to queer being. So, where are we now with eternity? Last year, I had a show in Mexico City called Constructing Eternity. This show visualized the first portrait of eternity as a space in the process of being realized, as a standalone reality, as an alternate plane of existence, separate from what it is that we are currently living in right now. So in the process of making this show, I ideated on different regions, new regions within eternity, while also developing existing ones. And so I was really interested in giving viewers a first glimpse of the scale of this world building project. And I did this by presenting these portraits of the inhabitants of different spaces of eternity, different regions of eternity, how these inhabitants could look like, the way they dress, the things that are important to them, and the spaces that they occupy. So starting with Angelus, which is now, I consider Angelus to be the capital region of eternity, and this is where the main body of water originates from, and it's thought to be very fertile and maternal in its essence. Then we move on from Angelus, where we would typically find a lot of mothers, a lot of newborns. Then we move to Luna Mira, which, as I said earlier, is the land of the wonderful moon, which carries a spiritual presence when land, light, and water intersect. From Luna Mira, we find ourselves in Dreaming, a small beach town off the coast. Dreaming is the first point of contact for outworlders who are venturing into eternity. And lastly, we have Santa Daisy, which is mountainous and characterized by its inconsistent but unique architecture. Santa Daisy is favored by its mostly queer population, as it's believed that these mountains offer a form of protection for them. Within eternity, it's very important to know also that all citizens of this space move freely throughout the territories, but there's an emphasis on finding community and thriving in functionality. So at the same time, during that exhibition, I started working on a map that probably is going to continue developing over the next couple years. But this is what the first depiction of eternity looks like, the first visual depiction. And And it was very important to me to have something tangible that I could reference and I could refer back to when speaking about this place, because I think that helps people to see it as its own thing, as its own standalone reality, as opposed to seeing it as like a maybe thing. So for me, the process of creating this map was very important to solidify the concept of eternity as a space and as a world that I will continue to build. So, following my exhibition in Mexico City and developing this first map of eternity, my current goal is to continue developing this world, now with a specific focus on relationships, as well as environmental and spiritual practices. In the process of constructing eternity, this architectural project is as much psychological as it is spatial. There's a multi-layered approach that once again borrows from thinkers like Homi Bhabha and Tony Presley Sanon, Vivi Clark, and their different ideas on this third space, or the possibilities that we open ourselves up to when we think beyond two extremes. Eternity follows the blueprint of these thinkers by serving as an alternate plane of existence where different Afro-diasporic cultures, histories, and identities can converge. This allows the inhabitants to step beyond the binaries of origin and destination in order to enjoy a very specific and unique presence. This third space, eternity, is a potential territory where the usual expectations of reality, like time, geography, and community, are fluid and reimagined. The framework also calls upon Bhabha's idea that identity is an ongoing process, one of negotiation rather than a fixed point. Keeping this in mind, each region of eternity sort of acts as a node for cross-cultural exchange that continuously adapts to those that inhabit the space. Filmmaking is vital when pushing forward new boundary-breaking ideas. Within the context of constructing eternity and putting forward these ideas, filmmaking, for me, acts as both a portal and a guide to explore its multitudes. By translating conceptual ideas into moving images, film makes eternity visible and navigable, very clearly highlighting its cultural, spatial, and emotional nuances. Through filmmaking, we start the process of dissolving boundaries between reality and imagination to reveal the subtleties of hybrid identity. Film also allows eternity to break out of this static or still depiction to emphasize fluidity, multiplicity, and the presence of new ways of being, as well as expanding on our memory and collective experience. To round this up, world building for me is an active practice, one that I now see started very, very early on in my life. Throughout this journey, there's been a lot of great thinkers, a lot of literature, a lot of films, a lot of conversations that I've had with people that have just opened my mind to further possibilities. I think it's very important for me at this stage in my career to be putting forward such an idea, because that just means I have so much to prove, which I'm looking forward to. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm Abby Sola. Thank you so much, Isabel, for coming to talk to us. And it's amazing having this inaugural residence program and that you're here first. So thanks so much. And I really loved having your films up. I wasn't expecting that. And I just wanted to say I love the title cards, like the typography. It's always so good every time. I really love that. But I have like one or two questions, but maybe I'll just ask if there's any questions available. I know there's some friends and supporters here, but if there's any strangers that want to ask a question, that's okay too. You're a friend and supporter?
Hi.
Hello.
That was great, Isabel. Thank you so much for sharing your brilliant mind with us. My question relates to something that you said in the very last portion, and also in the context of this residency being at a space that relates to architecture as well. So from what you've shown us, it very much looks like the primary construction material that you're using with everything is these ideas of the concepts. And you really touched on a lot of, I guess, like the physical qualities of these spaces, as well as like how the people will be navigating them. So looking into the things that you had mentioned that you'll be focusing on moving forward, could you speak to how some of those concepts will also serve as construction material for perhaps like the cultural practices of these people, and like how you think they might inform the social dynamics as well? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for that great question. I think, firstly, moving forward, I'm excited to learn more. I'm excited to read more literature because, like you said, a lot of this architectural process for me is happening in the realm of thought and not necessarily like a spatial one alone. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to read like more books, more papers by similarly minded people, ones that bring forth interesting concepts of space and alternate realities. So for example, like coming across the work of Homi Bhabha for the first time was very, very impactful. And I think that continuing to immerse myself within this like canon of thinkers will only propel this world forward and solidify the concepts. I think also something else that I'm looking to do now is through the films that I make moving forward, I want to be very intentional about the ways that I'm recontextualizing the space. A lot of the films you saw, literally, it's like the Scarborough Bluffs, or it's like a beach in Lagos, or it's like some places that we know and we've seen and we've experienced on the everyday that I then recontextualized and positioned within this framework of eternity. I think adding a layer of intentionality when it comes to that recontextualization will help a lot when it comes to solidifying concepts, interactions, and moving things forward. So, for example, traveling to very specific places that might have very specific architecture, and then having this as not just a one-off, but a moment to keep returning to, or an element or an aspect of this world that I can continue revisiting to make sense of. I think so far, a lot of the work that I've done within Eternity has leaned more towards the one-off aspect. So like very short films, very entry-level ideas, but I know definitely moving forward, there will be a lot more thoroughness. There will be a lot more consideration, and there will be a lot more like revisiting and referencing, because I think about my archive a lot. I think about referencing myself a lot. So going back to places, going back to specific people is one thing that I'm trying to do. There's some people who have made multiple appearances in Eternity over the last couple years, and I think things like that really help solidify this as a concept and not just something that I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a wonderful response, because I was going to ask about the geographic locations, because I know that it is like a conceptual spatial project that you're working on, but I think that placing, let's say, Scarborough Bluffs alongside, in your imaginary, a beach in Nigeria is now giving rise to some comparisons that, of course, there's lots to say, and it's unrecognizable when we just watch it in the audience, so it's really cool to think about that. And I think it's amazing then, too, how you had this early relationship with Catherine McKittrick, thinking about how she theorizes Black women's geography as demonic grounds, unfathomable, unchained, in a way that geography hasn't even gotten to. So I think that you're definitely like well connected to think about those things. Here we go, we got a question right at the front.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Abby. Congrats for being our inaugural filmmaker in residence, by the way. So,
Thank you.
I'm also just embarking my first year here at MVS in visual studies, so it's exciting unfolding U of T and Daniels. But looking forward to having tea or something. Question about, you said you arrived with your family at age 15?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm curious as to when you go back, do you consider yourself in the diaspora now, or do you still connect to Nigeria in the same way? I'm saying this too because I haven't been back to India since my last trip was like 35 years ago when I took my father's ashes, and I never went back because I just in terms of the socioeconomic conditions and the caste system and the things I wrestle with, whereas folks who leave India often can address anti-Blackness, but not necessarily anti-casteism. So I'm not saying that your experience is similar, but I don't know this, like I have never been to Nigeria, so I don't know. But yeah, any thoughts on diaspora, diasporatics, and you're also referencing Homi Bhabha quite a bit, so the third space and whatnot.
So I have family still back in Nigeria. My immediate family is back in Nigeria. I actually moved alone. I moved alone when I was 15 and was here for school. It was very similar to a lot of people around my age that time. I think in Nigeria, there's a very interesting class system where there's very clearly like the upper class, and then there's very clearly the lower class, but then there's this like very gray area where it's like you might be considered middle class, but like you're one big emergency away from like going down to lower class. So at the time I was 15, I remember very clearly there was a lot of conversations happening around the state of the country, the politics, and parents who could were doing everything possible to get their kids abroad, searching for something better, searching for safety, security, as we were faced with a country that we didn't really know where it was heading. We still don't really know where it's heading. But because I was so young coming here, I feel very lucky to have gone back home quite a few times. I think since I've been in Canada now for like 8 years, I go back home at least once a year because my mom lives there. Coming here at that age was definitely like a little bit of a shock. like, I don't even want to say it was like a culture shock, but it was just a shock for me. Like, there was just so much world that I hadn't really thought about. There were so many possibilities that I hadn't ever considered. And one of these was definitely like the harsh reality of racism, because growing up in a predominantly, what am I saying? In a country where it's only like mostly, except like expats, it's like only Black people. My framework was shaped in a very specific way. Like, I knew white people existed, but I don't think I understood whiteness as a social construct until I moved to Canada. And so being here and grappling with racism and other things, at the same time being exposed to like queerness, something that was never a possibility back in Nigeria, but then became like this like new thing that I felt I identified with. There was just a lot of tension, I think, in my early years in Canada. It was a lot of like internal negotiation with what I had come to know based off of the environment that I grew up in and what I was then experiencing in this new space. And so I think even this is one of the fundamental backings for my world building practice, just that first exposure to a different reality. And speaking in terms of going back home frequently, what I do notice is I think there's a general disregard for space when you're in it sometimes, until you leave and you return and you start to notice things about the space that were always an afterthought to you. And so going back home a lot after coming to Canada, something that I was very drawn to was the beach and like bodies of water. Lagos is an island, we're surrounded by water, but I didn't really go to the beach a lot while I was like growing up there. But the moment I moved to Canada and there wasn't like, it was winter, it was snowing. The next time I went home, I made the conscious effort to spend as much time as I could on the beach and enjoy that space. And then even in that process of spending time on the beach, I realized this added layer of like why it is I'm so drawn to like eternity as a word or as a concept. Because when you stand on the beach in Lagos or really anywhere and you look straight ahead, it's like you're looking into eternity. You're just looking straight into the distance. And so for me, spending all those times like looking out and just like seeing, I think really encouraged me to recontextualize this space and then also impose where I was coming from Canada to this space to create like my own third space.
Thanks so much. That was such a deep response, and I really appreciated that. In terms of personal history, and you started off by saying it's important to recognize that you're an artist, or your artist practice starts from the minute you're born. So I really see that in the way you speak. There's a queue. I'm sorry. So I'm going to follow, I'm going to follow it loosely. Some people are dropping out.
Hi, Isabel.
Hello.
Your music soundtrack, I think, is really important. I feel I'm looking at those films and sensing a kind of evolution. Come to Me, I'm Already Here is a really dynamic soundtrack, and you know there was a lot of repetition, you know, in the rhythmic pattern and the percussion, and I'm just wondering about that aspect. We're talking a lot about the visuals, but to me, it's so important with the immersive experience, like the music. And even the absence of sound, you know. So could you talk a little bit about maybe thinking about that last film, like where you source that music, and what are your thoughts about the connection between this world building and the audio part of it, not just the visuals, but this audio soundtrack?
Yes, I just want to make sure I don't butcher the name. Oh, okay. So the score for that film, Come to Me, I'm Already Here, was done by Emmanuel. His Instagram is Prince of Vanity, and he's a close friend of Adeju's. And with that specific soundtrack, going to a heritage site, like a UNESCO heritage site to film, this is the Sacred Grove in Oshobo, Osun State. Going to a site that just carried so much weight and so much history. Coming into it, we wanted a sound that was very intense, but also would like do a great job of absolutely locating you in where you need to be. So the sound has a very, very nice way of grounding you in the film. As the visuals start to come on, and like you said, there was a lot of repetition, not just in the percussion or in the sound, but also in the film. There was this, it was almost like a constant loop. And so I was also thinking a lot about like repetition as a form of manifestation, and the ways that like saying something over and over and over again can really solidify it and make it real, make it come true, make it come to pass. And so I think that generally speaking, with all the sound in my work, I'm always trying to help people locate themselves within the film, within the visuals. So a few years ago, I watched this film by John Akomfra. It was called The Last Angel on Earth, right? The Last Angel of History? Yeah, The Last Angel of History. And in this film, he was talking about like sound and this conversation between the old and the new world that happens when you hear the beat of the drums. I actually referenced that in the first film, The Other Side of Dreaming. And so for me, sound also is a bridging element. It's a way to bridge the spatial and the mental. And I think that sound really helps open up the film or the images a lot more, leaving a lot of space for you to really sit in something and observe it, take it in, and then reflect on it at the same time. I think sound is crucial because it can, depending on how it's made, it can manipulate so much of how a viewer interprets like the work. So yeah, sound is very important, and I try a lot to work with the same team. So the first 3 films were scored by the same artist, Oshunda, and then the last film was scored by Emmanuel.
Thank you.
The next question comes from a collaborator of yours, so I'm just going to rush over.
Hello. You might have answered some of my questions, but it's something I just realized within all your films is that they are shot like in the outdoors, like in the woods, in the forest, in the ocean. And I also acknowledge that normally when artists, filmmakers are trying to imagine or dream up a future, it's always very, very technology heavy and, this sci-fi and whatever. But within your work, you've kind of, introduced something very, very fresh. You've kind of, you have the forest and the water as a threshold for imagining and otherwise. And it made me kind of rethink what technology is and what technology could be. And I started, within your other films, I started looking at the dress, whether it be the sound or the drums or, dance, the ritual of dance as technology, for kind of like, thinking of a futurity. I don't know. So maybe I just want you to talk a little bit more about the outside and and being outside.
Yeah, the outdoors are very important to me. Growing up in Lagos, there weren't a lot of free open spaces that we could go and enjoy. Everything was taxed. Like, you paid to go to the beach, you paid to go to the park, you paid to walk on the street sometimes. It's just like everything was taxed. And so then thinking about that, then coming to like the Western world and like growing up here, thinking about the politics of the outdoor space, who is allowed to enjoy the outdoors, who's allowed to blast music, who's allowed to eat, who's allowed to do certain things in the outdoors. And so for me, when it came to like constructing eternity, I was very intentional to steer away from those like heavy technological futuristic depictions of an other world, because firstly, I wanted something that felt realistically achievable. I wanted something that didn't seem too far-fetched, that didn't alienate people, but rather felt familiar enough for them to see themselves in, because that's the whole point of eternity, creating this space where people can see themselves existing and enjoying natural space. And so the outdoors became this phenomenon for me because it was like, it felt at some point almost like I was working counterintuitively. Like I would be trying to create like dreaming or something, this space within eternity, but then I'm in the Scarborough Bluffs, and there's things that are in the Scarborough Bluffs that to me don't exist in eternity, but I was at the mercy of that specific space. So there's a lot of work that's done when it comes to recontextualizing space and the outdoors. But something else that I also enjoy about the outdoors is the possibility of placelessness. So depending on things like framing, composition, sound, movement, I can create a work that's in Toronto. I can create a work in dreaming here in Toronto, and I can create a work in dreaming back home in Lagos, and have these two worlds, even though it's happening on different sides of the world, come together to stand for one thing. I think that's the power of placelessness, and that's something that I really try to navigate within my work. I think the outdoors does a very great job at that. There's things that are definitely harder than others. Even thinking, for example, about like seasons, like I can't do a lot of my work here because it's cold half the year, or things like that. But I think that there's a lot of potential in the outdoors, and then presenting Black people in this space, in these spaces. I think there's a lot of potential for these images and depictions to really steer the cultural canon in a different way. One that emphasizes that space should be not a luxury, but a necessity for everyone. One that shows people like me coming into this space with no pressure, with no added like onus to be any type of way, and really just exist freely.
Thank you so much. I really admire how you balance and hold placelessness with placemaking, because a lot of the time I was thinking of this word placemaking as you spoke, but placelessness like bears so much weight as well. We're gonna wrap up just with one final question.
I was hoping my question would not be the last one. But, thank you, Isabel. Thank you for sharing your work, and thank you for the generosity in your sharing and responding to the questions. So, in your work, you talk about several points of distinction, not necessarily departure. So, reality, dream, present, future, and also the notion of the individual and the community. So my question is, in the notion of world building, you certainly talk about you yourself as an individual and the way in which you exercise agency to build the world and how you reflect that world through your art. I'm wondering what the role of community is in world building vis-a-vis the individual.
So for me, this act of world building is a communal one. I'm constantly in conversation with my friends, my community, with people. Even having conversations like this, I think, does a lot for me when it comes to developing or constructing eternity. I think about community in the sense of shared thought. I think about community in the sense of sharing space. I think about community in the sense of representation, and I think about community in the sense of honesty. And I think that within eternity, there is more than anything a desire to create honest representations of Black life and Black interactions, Black communal interactions. I think that the biggest thing for me is understanding that this world does not exist without the people in it or the people that I'm putting in it. This world does not exist without the conversations that I'm having with people. This world does not exist without people then coming into this world with their own thoughts, with their own perspective, with their own understanding of everything. I think that community is at the core of everything that I do, and I look forward to a time in the future where, after having developed eternity as its own conceptual idea and space, I can then work with other collaborators or like-minded artists who might be interested in maybe creating something under this framework of eternity. I think that's a really big part of where I'm trying to go. I'm trying to get to a place where eternity becomes this concept that other thinkers feel inclined to explore, and feel safe exploring and making their own. So I think that's why it's very important for me to do things like this, to have the conversations archived, because they push everything forward and keep the work going.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is my closing remarks, so please get home safe. Peace and love. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all for coming. It means a lot to me that you were here. This is recorded, I think. Yes. So feel free to watch it again after or share it with anyone who might have wanted to come but couldn't make it today. Thank you so much.